So this evening is going to consist of several parts. First, we will be given a presentation by Rev Mark Coleman. Mark, can you give us a wave? Super. We'll then have our interlude, and then we will hear from Dr. Rob Alton. Can you give us a wave, Rob? Hey. Then we'll hear from Reverend Sheena Gabriel, who is Rob's wife and also a Unitarian minister, and I saw that. There was a wave there. Well done, Sheena. After we've heard all three, we'll then be put into breakout rooms for 10 minutes so that we can discuss what you've seen and heard before we bring you back in for the questions and answers session, during which Mark, Rob and Sheena will try to answer anything you want to raise. Could I also introduce you to our techie bod, Nicola, who very graciously stepped in to help when it was realised that Rory couldn't assist this evening. You're a star. Give us a wave. Come on, switch your camera back on and give us a wave. Wave! Yay! There she is. Well done. So let's begin. I just hope that you can hear me. I have known Reverend Mark Coleman since 2014. We were both new to our ministries. I had just started as minister at Rochdale Unitarians, and Mark had only been in post a couple of months as Vicar of Rochdale. We became good friends. In mid-August, I received an invitation from him to attend a presentation regarding Extinction Rebellion. Mark is an active member of the XR. That presentation changed my whole outlook on climate change, which is why I felt so strongly that we should have this event. We all hear the little sound bites on the media about the ice caps melting and dreadful fires in Australia at the end of last year and beginning of this, and was present in California, only when it was all put together and much more that it really hit home to me. I am so pleased that Mark agreed to do this presentation for us. Thank you, Mark, and I'll let you get on. I'll get into your presentation for you.
Thank you so much, Shammy, and thank you, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here with you all, and it's great. Thank you. And yes, I'm just really an ordinary member of Extinction Rebellion, and I'm very keen to share the story and to tell the facts. So I'll do that in a moment. And if you've got questions, as Shammy said, do save them up. But everything I say has like a footnote to it. So those who have questions, we can eventually give you or point you towards an article or, you know, some evidence about the facts. So thank you. Right. Shammy, can you share the presentation, please? Next slide, please. That's fine. Next slide, please. We'll talk more about Extinction Rebellion later on, but for now, just one slide of introduction. We are a non-violent, direct action civil protest organisation. We're everyday citizens, we're not all vicars, thank goodness, looking for a solution to the climate and ecological crisis. And we all recognise that individual action is not going to be enough to tackle these crises. Therefore, we must get our governments, both here, at home and internationally, to take decisive action on our behalf. They must support us and protect us, as they pledged to do when they came to power. Next slide, please. Perhaps the world's most pressing problems are all closely interlinked. At the heart of it sits power. Power, financial and governmental, is concentrated in the hands of a very small minority of humanity. Think of our political leaders and big corporations. Think of financial institutions and the very rich. This concentration of power doesn't care about the damage it does to the earth, and it perpetuates gross inequalities. It's impossible to do justice to global justice in one slide, but here are some examples. You would have many more. we see how people of colour are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate in the global south, climate change in the global south. And of course, the same is happening with COVID in our industrialised nations. So you start to see connections. Next slide, please. Our civilization is more fragile than we would like to think. And this recent pandemic that we're still in the middle of shows how vulnerable our big, strong technological society really is. It gives us a timely clue and maybe a warning what the much bigger and nastier monster of the climate crisis will be like. And so going back to business as usual, which is the direction governments are taking us, is not an option. Next slide. We are causing climate destruction and ecological destruction, and these together threaten the survival of living creatures and plants, as well as ourselves. So I'm going to start with the climate crisis. Next slide. So here you have a graph showing CO2 levels over a long period, from the year 0 up to pretty recently. And you can see things are pretty steady. And if you click again, Shammy, you'll start to see what happens after the industrial age begins. And the scientific consensus is overwhelming on all this. There is no doubt left that human beings are causing global heating. This consensus is shared by over 99% of climate scientists, according to an ongoing study. And moreover, scientists from all over the world agree that 100% of global warming since 1950 is due to humans, and that nearly all the heating since 1850 is due to greenhouse gas emissions and other human activities. And this chart, this hockey stick graph, shows how global average temperatures have been rising in tandem with carbon dioxide. Shows the concentration of carbon dioxide over the past 2,000 years, that's the red line, and then the average annual temperatures from 1880 to 2019 on the blue squiggly line. The graph is called a hockey stick graph, as I said, and you can see why. Although there's a little bit of variation over time, generally it's pretty steady until the industrial age begins. Before the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. And after the Industrial Revolution, it begins to skyrocket, as you can see. And this is due to the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. Last year, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was 411 parts per million. Well, none of it sounds a lot, but it has a massive effect. And each year brings new record levels, and the rate of increase is increasing too, accelerating. And this is temperature rise goes up in tandem. So we're already at 1.1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and we're heading for 3 to 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels, or even more by the end of the century. Next slide, please. Now, I'm sure somebody will have said to you, well, the Earth's had several warm periods in the past. What's the big deal? And that's true, but it is a story that gets put around in some of the press. And it's true there have been warm periods in the past, and these warm periods have happened, but they have not happened during our current human civilization. So this graph is a bit complicated, but bear with me. And you can see where the red line is. That's the period of civilization, the last 20,000 years or 10,000 years. Yes, last 10,000 years. We've had a stable climate. We do not know that we've never had a civilization in a climate that is 2 degrees warmer. And we've got no evidence that human beings would survive in a climate that is 4 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. So that's a warning that we don't know if we can carry on like this. There's lots of evidence that we can't. Next slide, please. The climate crisis is not something bad that might happen in the future. It is something bad that's happening right now. We're already seeing 4 big effects of just this 1.1 degrees centigrade of heating above pre-industrial levels. We've got the drought, Global warming has contributed to droughts since at least 1900, and the influence will get stronger. Storms, at the same time, too much water is a problem. When we introduce more heat, which is a form of energy, into a system, it becomes, well, more energetic. And so you get the wildfires and you get bigger storms, bigger, more devastating hurricanes are already evidence of climate change. And we get these horrible fires, which we saw in Australia and we've seen in California and probably are still continuing, and the Amazon and Siberia early in the year. The Australian fires in November last year destroyed an area the size of France, and an estimated 1 billion animals were burned to death. Sea level rises are another result of global heating, and melting glaciers and sheets. There's been a lot about this in the news recently, and there's conjecture that there'll be more big melts soon. The sea level rise is accelerating and has been unprecedented over the past century. And the worst case projection of a 2-meter rise by 2100 cannot be ruled out. And of course, remember, most of us, well, not most of us, a lot of the human population live by the sea in this country, but all over the world, big populations live there. Next slide, please. We've talked about 1.1 degrees so far, but now we need to look in the future. So we're already at 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial levels, and we're heading for 3 degrees with the current policies. Now, you know how our government is not great. It's great at making policies, it just doesn't seem to keep them. Lots of resolutions and plans, but they seem to replace action. So given those historic failures, we could be heading for 4 to 5 degrees of heating by the end of the century, which would be disastrous for most of the world's population. What will happen as the heating continues? Now, there's going to be a disaster. I guess it's a choice now between an unmitigated disaster and a less bad disaster. Can you click the slide again, please, Shammy? Next slide, please. And one of the results of all this heating is hunger, and world hunger is rising. After being in decline for many years, more than 820 million people do not have enough to eat. And many of these global heating-driven extreme weather events, such as the heat waves and the very heavy rainfall and coastal flooding, these are going to get more extreme both in frequency and intensity. More areas of the country of the world will experience severe water shortages due to droughts and the melting of glaciers. And by 2025, that's not far away, 4 billion people are projected to be living in water-stressed areas. That will result in some sort of climate chaos, mass displacement of somewhere between 200 million and 1 billion people by 2050. And this would be the greatest ever movement of people in the history of humankind. If the global temperatures reach 3 degrees centigrade, as is forecast by the end of the century, about a third of the world's population would be living in extreme heat. Next slide, please. We could be heading for a 4 to 5 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century. But there is a risk that it could be even worse, or whatever rise we get could be made worse by feedback loops and tipping points. I don't know if you know about these, but I'll just explain them as best I can. A feedback loop would be, for example, the ice melting in the Arctic or the Antarctic, and as the ice melts, it reveals dark land or dark sea underneath. And of course, the ice reflects the heat back into the sky. But once that ice goes, the heat is absorbed into the ocean or into the land, and so it increases the rate of warming. So that would be what's called a positive feedback loop, although of course it's not very good news. And a tipping point, an example of that would be the methane, which is even more of a climate heating gas than carbon dioxide, the methane that's trapped in the permafrost, for example, in Siberia. And this methane, as the ground thaws suddenly would become released into the atmosphere in large burps. So there is this prospect, which is very hard for scientists to quantify, but there's evidence for these feedback loops and tipping points. Next slide. So in summary, the longer we leave it, the more difficult it gets. We need to take really drastic action now to reduce emissions. We've got to do this, and the longer we leave it, the more drastic it would have to be later. And coronavirus has shown us what drastic measures can look like. I guess they show us that they can be taken, but also they have big effects on the economy and other things. So we must take action very, very soon. To have some chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of warming, global CO2 emissions need to reach zero by around 2025. Now, if we had begun reducing emissions in 2000, 10 years after the world knew for absolute certainty that we had to cut emissions to reduce the risk of climate change, a reasonable chance to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees would have required more modest reductions of about 4% a year, and that could have been easily achieved. But I guess it's no good having regrets. We need to now just push for drastic cuts in carbon emissions now. Next slide, please. But it's not just the climate, it's also the ecology. And I don't know if any of you saw the BBC documentary with David Attenborough. But lots of very powerful images about the destruction of the planet's ecology. And this is leading to a real crisis in the biosphere. Another click, please, Shammy. Humans depend on a healthy, natural world for our well-being and survival. Everything is connected, and scientists know this more and more. So yes, there's a report just published by the United Nations last year called about the natural world. And here are some highlights from it, or well, bad news highlights. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinction is accelerating. Because actually species become extinct normally, but the rate of extinction is now 10 to 100 times higher than the usual rate. Humans affect now 3/4 of the land, 2/3 of the oceans, and 3/4 of fresh water, leaving little room for anything else. So we're in a real nature crisis. This is leading to a mass extinction of species. There have been 5 previous mass extinctions in the Earth's history. The last one was 66 million years ago. And this current one is not caused by comets from the sky, it's caused by human consumption. And we know it's happening and why it's happening. And so maybe it's not an extinction, maybe it's more of an extermination. Next slide, please. If we do nothing else, we must stop now carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning. Everything else is secondary, because if we don't do that, we will fail. It is that straightforward. To have any chance of keeping below 2 degrees centigrade of warming, we need to stop the CO2 rapidly, entirely, and forever. So that graph that we saw earlier needs to flatten off quickly and then start to go down. It cannot keep creeping up or even accelerating. Personal action on its own will fail, and I'm sure many of us have taken lots of personal steps to reduce our carbon footprint, and that's all great, but on its own it won't be enough. It is critical that our new approach encourages governments, international organizations and corporations to change, and that's what Extinction Rebellion is here to do. Next slide, please. What have we tried so far as a human family? We've had global agreements, country-level legislation, legal challenges, traditional campaigning, and personal commitments to reducing emissions. And none of our efforts have worked. And how do we know that? Because we've got this little graph which reminds us the International Panel on Climate Change was created in 1988. And since then, we have emitted more carbon dioxide knowingly than all of our emissions previously. Just take that in. So since we knew about this in 88, we've emitted more than right back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. And there are no signs that this tendency is changing, even when you include the effect of COVID-19. When people tell you we're making progress, as politicians are wont to do, look at this graph. If this graph keeps going up, then we are failing, and that's what's happening at the moment. Next slide, please. So what do you do? When the rules don't work for us, you have to break the rules. We won't be the first ones to do so. In fact, breaking the rules in the name of a good cause has a long and noble tradition. It's been used successfully many times in the past, notably by Gandhi, who organised the rebellion in India against British rules, and Rosa Parks, who famously refused to give up a seat on a bus to a white person and triggered the American Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King, who organised that movement and mobilised huge numbers of Americans to force changes to all the racially discriminatory laws. These people and all the people who surrounded them are heroes now and even taught in our primary schools, but at the time they were vilified as criminals for breaking the law. And you may have noticed that throughout history, elites with power and money tend not to give away rights without being pressured to do so. And if you think of the universal vote, women's suffrage, gay marriage rights, racial discrimination, desegregation, liberty from colonial rule, equality of the law, all of these things, and apartheid too, and no doubt hopefully Belarus too is on the way to liberation. This all requires brave people resisting. And so Extinction Rebellion favours civil resistance, sometimes called disobedience or non-violent direct action. And that's where you and me, normally law-abiding citizens, break some rules and laws as a way to force change in a system that is refusing to change. And that's why in Extinction Rebellion, our tactics are these sorts of actions. Next slide, please. And there's a bit of a science to non-violent direct action, but it's simple at root. It's about carrying out things that are disruptive and create dilemmas for the authorities. And we need people who are willing to do things that risk arrest. Arrest itself is a form of disruption. It uses police resources and court time. But we do find that our court cases have created thousands of opportunities to present the case to the judiciary, and each one of those defences that are heard, these witness statements, are inspiring, and many, of course, have been let off in the courts and found innocent. However, for every person who is what we call an arrestable, we need 20 or more other people who are part of the movement to support them. So we're a big family of lots of people. Not everyone is getting arrested all the time. We've got artists and legal observers, trainers and cooks and singers and samba bands, organisers, climbers, and so on. You don't have to get arrested. There are so many ways you can help, and we really do need you, whether you have an hour a week or are able to give up your job to volunteer full time, as some have done. So please do consider whether you can help the movement and be part of it. And the science is, and there's some evidence here, that it works when it's a mass movement, when you get a broad and diverse movement, and we want to have 1 million people actively involved, and that would really make the government wake up. Next slide, please. We've got 3 big, clear demands. Next slide, please, Shammy. Yeah, 3 demands. The first demand, click please, is for the government and media to tell the truth, the full truth about the situation we're in, because people do not know the full truth. They do not know the science. And that means the kind of information we covered in the first half of this talk. Everybody should be told about this in the same way that people were told about the threat from Nazi Germany. Not like all the confusion and lies we've seen from governments and from the BBC for much of the time, where you get someone from a think tank who was funded by an oil company to come on and spread some doubt. So the truth must be told. Next click, please. And then we want the government, as I'm sure you will have guessed, to cut the greenhouse gas emissions to reach net zero by 2025. As soon as possible, this has to stop. The emissions have to stop quickly. And next click. And the third demand is for a citizens' assembly. And this is a beautiful and simple and powerful idea where you trust the people. These are precious people who live in our world, and they should be trusted because the governments have let them down. And the citizens' assembly is a way to do this, where the people get together with scientists, they see what's happening, they make recommendations to the governments which are legally binding. The government would commission and fund these assemblies. XR would not be involved in it at all. We just want it to happen. We just want democracy to be strengthened. Next slide, please. That's me near to the end now. I just want to say you don't need any permission to get involved with Extinction Rebellion. You can visit the website for all sorts of information on our demands, our values, our events, our groups. There are lots of ways to get involved. I know there are people here tonight who've got experience of being a Unitarian and XR, and you'll have your own connections. But I've just share something from some training I did in nonviolent direct action. It was at Manchester Students' Union last year before I got arrested in the October Rebellion. And I sat next to a doctor from Cheshire. There were someone from XR Muslims, lots of students. So you have affinity groups, you have a diverse group of people. Anyone can be part of XR. You don't need permission, you don't need to pay a membership fee, you just agree that these are the principles you want to abide by and you get active. So 2 key takeaway things before I do finish. Please, please, please do not believe for a second that if you've made your personal commitments, then you've done your bit. We've got to force government action. Personal commitments are not enough. And the second thing is, do not believe that you can leave it to me and a few other geezers. It really does need mass mobilization. It really needs you. We need lots more people. Your planet needs you. Life itself needs you. Thank you.